Hi. We're going to continue our run through the Bible with the book of Exodus. Now, I said I'm not necessarily going to take all the books in order, but I felt that this one should really come after Genesis. And we may take the books in order. I just don't know. It's as God leads. Now, the book of Exodus is basically the story of the birth of the Jewish people, or the birth of the nation of Israel. We've had Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and the story of Joseph, and they've led us to a place whereby the burdening, the new nation of Israel is going to be blossomed or bloom, and they've led us from the land of Canaan into Egypt, where they're likely to stay until the end of the famine. So we start with the story of Exodus, and it's basically the story of 2 million slaves escaping the most highly fortified nation in the whole world. It's the greatest escape story ever told in history, and 2 million people is a gigantic number of people. So Moses, in his lifetime, saw more miracles than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all put together. And with most of the miracles, God is manipulating his own creation for the sake of the nation. So he's utilizing his whole creation for the sake of one extended family group. This event had national significance for the people of Israel, and this was the beginning of their national history, so to speak. This is when they got their political freedom and their freedom from oppression, and this is the first time that they were known as a nation in their own right, because before this they were just a people of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, with that family as the basis of their as the basis of their family, which has expanded now, and we eventually, by the time that Moses gets the people out of the country of Egypt, there are around about 2 million. And though they didn't have a land, they were now a people, a nation with their own name, and forever afterwards they would celebrate this event every year. They hold their Passover, and this was when they discovered that their God was greater than any other God in this world, and he was the God who'd created the whole universe. They came to believe that their God was certainly at this point greater than all the gods of Egypt. Ultimately, they would realize that their God was the only God who mattered. And it's here that he has the title El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. And it's in Exodus that we are given God's name, which we'll come to a little bit later. The creator of everything became the redeemer of a few. And it's that aspect of creator and redeemer that we have to always place together. The creator and redeemer go side by side. Now, this is one of 5 books written by Moses. 4 books are very much the same, but 1 book is set apart. And the book that's set apart is Genesis. Genesis stands alone. Genesis is the only book that in its entirety is about the times before Moses was alive. And all the rest were written about things that happened during his life. These were a bunch of slaves who were without their own land or anything else. They needed to be told their roots in Genesis. And that was the whole point of Moses writing the book of Genesis, was to give them a foundation, to give them their roots, so that their roots could be passed down. And Moses went around collecting this information up, and he put it all together in the book of Genesis. The 4 other books are a mix of narrative and legislation. The first half of Exodus is what God did, and the second half is what he said. It's God's grace towards them versus God's expectation of gratitude. So it's redemption against righteousness. They were set free first, then given the law to keep by gratitude. And God was expecting them to uphold their law, the law he gave them, because they were grateful for being released. It didn't quite work that way. You were redeemed first, and then you live a righteous life. Then they go through a marriage ceremony with God. They are set free from slavery, but set free from slavery for service to God, just as we are set free from slavery to sin to serve God. In Hebrew, this book is called These Are the Names. And as I've said before, the naming of the books is pretty easy in Hebrew. It's on a scroll, so the first couple of words in the book is the name of the book, and the first couple of words in this book is These Are the Names. When it was translated into Greek, they used 2 Greek words, ex, which means out, and hodos, which means way. You could potentially have in a theatre where you've got the word exit, that's a Latin word. You could have exodos, which means way out. completely an unnatural story, and many people ask, did this really happen? Many people have questioned whether this is just a fable. There is no record of these happenings in other records other than the Bible, and there's no recordings of this happening in for example the Egyptian history books. But then again, why would you record 2 million slaves walking out of enslavement to your country? It would, for want of a better word, it would be vastly humiliating to record that. The numbers involved create another problem for other people. Approximately 2.5 million people, to say nothing of their animals and all the transport that was needed, and to say nothing of the fact that some Egyptians went with them. The figures are absolutely staggering, and yet it happened. There is no date, so we don't know which pharaoh it is, and therefore we don't know which century it was. There are two possibilities that scholars look at. One is the 15th century BC, and the other is the 13th century BC. If it was the 15th century, it was a pharaoh called Thutmose. And if it was the 13th century, it was Ramesses II. And a lot of scholars lean towards the 13th century. The pharaoh was a vastly powerful emperor, and the most powerful he was in command of the most powerful military force in the known world. Then there is a dispute about the route which they took. Did they go to the north, to the south, or did they go down the middle? And we'll have a look at that in the coming weeks. All these things made people doubt. Well, let's look at a couple of facts. The existence of a nation called Israel, where did they come from? If they were a bunch of slaves, we do know that they were slaves from historical records. So that slavery side of things is a fact. And the fact that every Jewish family celebrates the Passover and has done from that moment until now. These are some of the facts that are indisputable, and you've got a nation of 2.5 million people. Why would they suddenly make up this story and start celebrating a Passover 1 year on from a nothing occurrence? It doesn't make sense, and you would have great difficulty trying to persuade 2.5 million people to do exactly the same thing on exactly the same day if there wasn't some substance to it. They went to Egypt in the time of Joseph and spent 7 years in Goshen, where they had everything. So why didn't they go home after the famine was over? Well, effectively they became comfortable. With Joseph as the head honcho, they would have been given the best of everything. Life would have been easier for them for a start. For a start, there wasn't any snow there. And God hadn't given them this land. He hadn't given them any land in Egypt. He had given them the land of Canaan. And effectively, or basically, they outstayed their welcome. I'm sure that Joseph died, and the person that took over Joseph's role was an Egyptian, and they suddenly realized, hang about, there's a lot of these people. Now, what are we going to do with them? Are we going to just leave them assimilate into our Egyptians, or because they're keeping themselves to themselves, are we better off enslaving them and putting them to work for us? Well, the second probably happened, and they had outstayed their welcome, and they did everything at that time without consulting God. And then they cry out to God, why are you doing this to us? It's the same old story. You go your own way, you do your own thing, and then when things go wrong, you cry out to God and ask him why he's doing this to you. In essence, you've done it to yourself. But God let them stay there 400 years. So there was 400 years of crying out to God, save us. And God had explained everything to Abraham, that his people will stay in Egypt until the wickedness of the Canaanites is complete. And as they stayed there, they became a larger and larger people until they get to the size of 2.5 million people. Well, we're going to leave it there tonight, and at the end of the week we'll travel some more into the book of Exodus, and we get to encounter Moses for the first time and start moving through his journey. God bless.